The world of podcasts is growing by the day, and we're excited that so many of the coaches on our platform are looking to expand into the space. We're thrilled to have Dan Kendall with us today, founder of Mission Based Media and the Health Podcast Network, for a masterclass on how to create, repurpose, and communicate meaningful content that will help your health and wellness coaching business grow. Please welcome my friend, Dan.
Hello, everyone. Thanks so much for having me. It's a real pleasure to be able to speak to this audience. Second year in a row, so thanks for the invitation. There's a lot that we're going to get through. I hope that someone's going to be able to take some questions. We've received some questions from the audience before we started. So let me just go ahead and dig in because we don't have a lot of time to get through everything. Let me just first of all start by introducing myself. My name is Dan Kendall. 25 years, more than 25 years now in the healthcare industry. Started podcasting in 2016 after many years of listening to podcasts. And I realized that nobody was talking about what I was doing for a living, which was really trying to innovate and push new innovations and services into the healthcare market. So I started creating a podcast to talk about that exact thing. With Digital Health Today, that's now grown to 4 shows. It's now a channel on Apple Podcasts, and we have different hosts leading different authentic conversations. As Marina mentioned, I also formed Health Podcast Network. I encourage all of you to go over and take a look at Health Podcast Network to see the sort of content that's being shared there by creators and connected with listeners. We'll talk about some of the reasons for that, hopefully, in this session today. And thirdly, we've also launched Health Unmuted, which is a brand new initiative. We only launched this a few weeks ago. It is a audio library consisting of various mini-series, set numbers of podcasts around specific health topics. So we just launched one about COPD, very cleverly named the COPD podcast. We have ones in the works around Alzheimer's, acid reflux, depression, Parkinson's, psoriasis, skin cancer, a variety of other kinds of cancers. And you can imagine there's a lot that we can talk about in an audio format. The purpose of today's session is really how to create, repurpose, and communicate using meaningful content. And my first question is really to you all, which is what would you like to know? I received some of those questions earlier that people have been messaging in and tweeting and sharing through social media. But if you could just take a minute and note some of those questions, I will go through some of the ones that we already have. But there's obviously a lot that we can cover when it comes to podcasts. And while you're doing that, while you're typing in those questions, I'll just explain a little bit more about my business, Mission Based Media. That's the business I started a few years ago. We believe that health information should be more accessible. I believe that's why you guys are doing what you do and as health coaches to really try to make people understand how they can take better care of themselves and how they can make those behavioral changes to improve themselves. And really our goal is to make sure that people can connect with stories of other people, whether they're professionals or fellow patients, just other human beings that are going through their health journey. There are 3 things that we do, which gives me sort of the authenticity to speak to you all today. Number 1, we have production services. So we actually produce podcasts for major organizations. We have original content, which I just mentioned with Health Unmuted and Digital Health Today. And then we also provide advertising and distribution for podcasts through Health Podcast Network. So we're focused entirely on the healthcare market. We really believe there's a lot that can be done here to serve through audio first content. And if you've typed in some of these questions, maybe these match what you already want to know. So as I said, there's a lot that we could cover. These were some of the questions that came in. Is podcasting a good outlet? Podcasting versus Clubhouse? How can we create content? And how do we start a podcast? You can read them all here. Why don't I dive into this? And Marina, maybe you can come back because there are a lot of questions here. I have a lot of slides that I don't necessarily have to go through. If you've received some questions, feel free to pop in and ask those to me at any time. I'm not able to see any of the questions that are coming up here on screen. So feel free, Marina, just to pop in and ask me questions. Great.
Will do. Absolutely.
So just from a history perspective, a lot of people say, why would you want to create a podcast? Because, isn't that just a fad? It's just going to go the way of Vine or some, MySpace. Why should we really do it? If you think about what a podcast is, it's really these audio stories that we've been talking about for millennia. That's the way that we knew when to plant seeds, when to harvest crops, when to hunt, when the salmon swim upstream, when it was time to lamb the lambs. All these these sorts of things that got passed along through stories, and even, who to worship and who to marry and how to address relationships and war. All these things were passed along through audio stories. If you look at the way that we began to distribute those wirelessly back 100 years ago in the 1920s, after the last pandemic, people began to have a whole new way of connecting. And now we have this whole new way of doing it where people can really niche into their audiences. It's not just a broadcast that's going out over their airwaves to anyone around. It's really people can select exactly what they want to connect with and where. Quick history here. You don't have to read all of this, but again, addressing that, is this a fad question? YouTube and iTunes have been around for about the same period of time. So that in 2005 was when iTunes came out and podcasting began, and that really was the start for this whole new audio first content. So we've had video content through YouTube that has just grown exponentially over the past 15, 16 years. And now we've seen a massive swell of audio first content through iTunes. So if we flash forward to 2021, almost over 4 million different podcast titles. So those are shows that are created by different leaders, brands, hosts, celebrities, whatever they might be. That's the actual titles there, over 4 million of those, and over 50 million episodes. So that's great in terms of validation for the market and why people should be there. But it also does present a challenge, because if you're going to create a podcast with 2, 10, 20 episodes, maybe 100 over time, how do you really stand out against that backdrop? And that's, again, part of what we did with Creating Health Podcast Network. And this is not, in my opinion, going to go away. We have not seen any slowdown in the YouTube channel's growth. There are more minutes of video being added every minute, every second than there were previously. So that's continuing to grow. And while podcasts might be a little bit late to the game compared to the YouTube growth or video growth, I'm convinced that we're going to continue to see this as a part of our overall marketing channel. And we're seeing that in the numbers. You can go back and press pause on this recording to go into this a little bit more depth. You can also email me. I'll share with you any of this information. So how do you communicate, repurpose, and create meaningful content? So first of all, the big thing is to listen. We'll talk about that. We'll talk about how to speak. That's first of all, as a guest. You can, of course, begin to create a show, but being a guest, particularly if you're going to have guests, it's good to have that experience. Just like anything where you need authenticity, it's good to have experience being a guest, and then you can produce. So where can you find things? I trust that all of you are already podcast listeners. There are a variety of different podcast channels out there. Tune in. Of course, the major ones: iTunes, Google, Spotify. You see a lot of them listed here: Radio Public, Stitcher, SoundCloud. So many different places where you can go to find them. Choose your favorite platform, whatever you like most from your operating system, or find one in an app store, and just start to browse. Type in some of the key terms that you like. Listen to what's out there. If you're going to create a podcast, you need to know where else your audience can be spending their time. And that's going to be your competition. Now, that doesn't mean you shouldn't do one if you find something that's similar. Just like there's more than one late night program and there's more than one news channel. People have different tastes and flavors, and they resonate and relate to different people in different ways. So just because you find something that you might really enjoy, listen to that and learn from it. And don't listen to it simply as an audience member. Pay careful attention to what they're doing. How are they asking their questions? How are they setting things up? How are they creating suspense? What's the use of music? Do they have music come in? Do they have music for transitions? How long are they? That's a big question I often get asked about. How long should the podcast be? One of the things that we've seen, particularly because of the pandemic, is people have not been commuting as much. So there's been a reduction in the overall attention span of people. While podcast listening is up, the length of the podcast that they're listening to has reduced, and that's because commuting has really changed over the past 2 years. So take a look at what's out there, find things, use different search terms. There are tens of millions of podcasts out there, as I mentioned, so you're going to have a lot to get through, but you'll see some of the challenge in standing out there. Look at the cover art, look at the messaging, look at the titling, and see how you can go through and listen to things that you would want to enjoy, and also listen for things that you want to avoid doing, because that can be another good way to learn.
Hey, Dan.
Yes.
There are a couple of questions that popped up, so I just want to make sure you address them throughout the presentation. So one is there's so many podcast channels. How do we make ourselves stand out to get our message out there? That's one. And then another one is how can podcasting help to build a coaching business and help a coach acquire clients?
Okay, great. Yeah, those are great questions. I actually did find the chat on my screen here, so let me answer that. So many podcast channels. That's a great question. That's actually what we were solving for when we created Health Podcast Network. I don't want to make this sound like we're promoting ourselves. There's also Pharmacy Podcast Network. There's Healthcare Now Radio. What else is out there? There's a mental health news radio channel and network out there. There may be some others that I don't know of. I particularly like the use of networks because it helps us reach the listeners who are interested in certain topics. We created Health Podcast Network because guess what we wanted? A health podcast network. So very clever name. So if you go to healthpodcastnetwork.com, you'll see that. I have to say, I was actually just on it before this meeting, before this webinar, and we don't have any health coaching podcasts on there. And if you know of some that you like, get in touch with me, dan@missionbasedmedia.com. Let me know what's out there because we would love to have that on there. We're an invitation only network, but that's one of the ways that people can find that. Not for the complete listening experience. We'd like people to listen on our network, but we also provide links to Apple, Google, Spotify, because we recognize that people have different tastes. They may not always be up for listening to something that's around health. They might want something about sports or entertainment. And if they can do that inside a Spotify app or inside of an iTunes app, then they can do that. Hope that answers that question. It's not, it brings up a bigger point, which is creating the MP3 file is not the issue. We can talk about how to create the MP3 file. That's simple. The work starts once that's finalized and you're ready to get people to hear it, because there's no sense in one person having a telephone or one person having a fax machine. You need to have someone to communicate with. Dating myself with some of these references and fax machines, but you need to have someone to communicate with. And having that MP3 file is just the start of the real work. And we'll talk about that a little bit. How are we doing for time, Marina? Can you also try to keep me on track for time?
Will do. Rebecca's messaging you. Yep.
Yeah, I don't know what time we started. So yeah, I see that. Okay, great. Thanks. So what was the other question here?
How can podcasting help build a coaching business and help a coach acquire clients?
Okay, so can we just come on to that in a little bit then? Because I think
Absolutely.
the second piece. No, that's
just
great.
want to
Thanks
make
for
sure that
flagging
we
it.
address it, because that's what I think everybody's thinking, right? How can this help me grow my business?
Right. Okay. So if you're going to start a podcast, be a guest first. It's a good way to find your feet. It's a good way to see how different hosts operate. It's a good way to create relationships, because a big part of actually going back to that earlier question of how do you stand out in the crowd, collaboration between podcasters is really important. And being a guest on someone else's show, learning from them, telling them, hey, I'm thinking about starting a podcast too. What advice can you have for me? And hey, when I start, will you be a guest on my show? And have those experienced podcasters who have done a lot of different shows and have some of the street cred and the authenticity and the experience to come on your show and help walk you through it. It will give you a better sense of confidence. So do think about how you can be a guest. And then, of course, let's talk about creating a show. So let's think about the format. Again, when you're listening to other shows, think about what they're actually doing. Is it a solo cast? Is it them just saying, hey, it's Tuesday and here's the news update on Tuesday. I want to give you guys an update on this sort of thing. This is happening in the industry or in health, or it's Diabetes Awareness Month, or it's Breast Cancer Awareness Month, whatever it might be. Talk about that. Or, hey, I'm going to every week leading up to the holidays, I'm going to give you some tips around how to avoid, some of the overeating or stay fit as we go into the winter months, that sort of thing. So you can think about doing a solo cast. Of course, interviews are really heavily done. And this goes into some of the question that you asked in terms of how can you use this to create a podcast business. Getting people on to talk about subject matter expertise, something that they're really particularly passionate about and experienced with, have a lot of that authenticity that I'll keep talking about. That's a really good way to have those conversations. And one of the slides I have coming up talks about how we can use the story arc to try to really convey to reach those clients that you want to reach. You can read all these. I won't go through all these, but there's ways to repurpose content. There's ways that this webinar that we're doing could actually be repurposed into a podcast. We'd probably want to shorten it up a little bit and make it more relevant for an audio only listener because they don't have slides. But you can repurpose this sort of content. You can also do narrative storytelling. So talking to the audience and then playing little clips of audio that you've recorded earlier, or even on site if you're at an event or meeting with someone in person. So let's talk a little bit about what you'll need. I want to get into some of these questions that people have asked, but really simply, you're going to need a microphone. Obviously, the one that I put in bold there is the Samsung Q2. I just did a quick check on Amazon.com before this call. The Audio-Technica ATR 2100X, and I can email you all this again if you email it to Dan at missionbasedmedia.com. The Audio-Technica ATR 2100X is about $100. Samsung is just as good. It actually comes with some better accessories like the stand and the pop filter, the foam ball that goes on the end of the microphone. And it's, I think, $70 right now. The prices do vary sometimes, but the Samsung Q2U is a great product for an entry-level microphone. Actually, it's pretty good. I know a lot of podcasters that use it for $70. Headphones, you can get a fancy set like this. What I would suggest is don't skimp on the headphones. You do need a set of headphones. This was the Sony MDR 7506. You can use just wired white earbuds, but don't get a cheap set, something that's less large like this and get a cheap one, because it'll really hurt your ears and you won't be able to stand it. A recording platform, that was one of the earlier questions we had. You can use Zoom. We're using Zoom right now. There are some settings in Zoom that you can use to actually record each audio side separately, so we're not being combined into one audio file. So if my audio is really soft and the other person is really loud, you can balance those things out by having two separate audio files. But if they're saved together, then you won't be able to have that, and that's a problem when it comes to the listening experience, as well as for you or someone you hire on Fiverr or Upwork to actually produce it. It's going to be a problem to get those two sides leveled up. You've all been in the car and you've had the music up or the speaker up so that you can hear what someone's saying, and then the other person comes in and it blasts you out. We don't want that to happen when people have a podcast going on. Riverside is what I use. I used to use Zencaster. Both are really good platforms. Get the paid program. It's $20 a month for that. You can pay in advance to save some money, but it does a really good listening experience. Try it for 30 days or whatever the trial period is, and give that a chance and see how that works. But the bottom line is, get started. That's the best platform to use, is whatever is going to allow you to get started recording. That's the one that you should go with. A media host, you're going to need that. Podbean, Buzzsprout, Libsyn, Acast, there are loads of them out there. Health Podcast Network. We also provide hosting through a proprietary system that's called Megaphone.fm. It's not something that's available for general podcasters, but something that you could look at if you were interested in Health Podcast Network at some stage. But one thing I would say is don't use Anchor. Anchor is free. Anchor is robust. Anchor is sexy looking. Anchor is all these wonderful things. Anchor is free, and you get exactly what you pay for. It's a bad experience when you want to leave Anchor. They have some things in the terms that I won't get into, but I would just generally suggest you don't use Anchor. Pay $7, $5, $10 a month, or whatever it is, and get onto a paid platform. And then lastly, you need a plan. Let's talk about that. What is the plan that you need? If I can advance. There we go. No, I've gone too far. Here we go. Creating a show. So you need to have an idea of what you're trying to do, who you're trying to reach. The question that we had earlier about how can we build a coaching business and use podcasts to acquire clients. Well, who are your clients? Who are they? I'm confident that all of you, given that you're part of this community, you've already been really clear, really thoughtful throughout your training and your practice to really understand who it is that you're trying to serve. Who are the people that you really engage with, that you really know that they're struggling, whether it's around a particular health issue, a particular lifestyle or condition or background that they're dealing with. So really identify those people, and then go where they are. Look at what's available right now. What are they listening to? Ask them, what are they hearing? What are they tuning into? Where do they go to find these things? And really start to set out a plan of, okay, what is it that I'm going to do? Do that concept development piece. And in terms of doing a podcast, if you're really thinking about doing it, what I would suggest you do is to not say, okay, I'll do this once a week for the rest of my life, or I'll do this once a week for the next year, is to really make an outline like you would with a presentation, like what I'm doing here, to say, okay, what are the top points that I want to hit, and who am I going to contact, or how am I going to arrange that story? And again, we'll talk about story arcs momentarily. But plan that out in advance. So you can actually create a story arc within an episode, but you can also create a story arc across an entire series. So instead of saying you're going to do a podcast once a week or once a month, I actually started off thinking I would do 5 a week, which was crazy. There's no way that with my schedule I'd be able to do that sort of schedule. We really need to have something that's manageable. So lay out your plan for how, what stories do you want to tell, lay those into your schedule, and then figure out who you want to talk to. The post-production, you can learn to do it yourself. There's some automatic tools that are available. Riverside.fm has some post-production tools in that paid $20 a month plan. That's, I think, 5 hours a month that you get for that. So that's a really good value, I think, in terms of creating that post-production. And then the key thing is the promotion and the growth. Again, I'll come on to that in a little bit later. There's a lot to obviously talk about with podcasts, and we have very limited time. So I have to talk quickly, and I see a lot of questions popping up here. Here's the way a lot of guests want to lead the conversation. They want to talk a little bit about the problem, then they want to promote. I got a book. Or I've got a software problem, a software solution. I've got software, I've got an app, I got a software, I got a website, I got all these solutions, I got everything I can do for you. Promote. Doesn't really work. It doesn't serve the listener. The most important part of the podcast is the listener. This is what I try to structure a lot of my conversations around, which is, let's talk at the beginning about the problem. Let's understand that problem. And then let's talk about the pain that problem causes. How does it affect a person, a family, a business, a community, a country, a region? How does it affect all these different aspects of the N equals 1 and the N equals 7.4 billion people in the world? What are the financial costs, the human costs, the opportunity costs, the emotional pain that happens there? And it might look like a typo on my slide here, but I did it intentionally, because when you get through that pain, talk about the pain some more. Make the listener want it to stop. Make them want to say, okay, I get it. You're proving your authenticity. You're getting the guest, or you yourself are talking about the pain of this condition, or the pain of this problem, whether it's a service problem or a health problem or an access problem, and you're talking about it. Keep talking about it to really make the listener tune in and say, oh my God, I get it. I have no idea this was that bad. What's the plan? Take me to the promised land. How are we going to get out of here? How are we going to solve this problem? That's when you can talk about, okay, so what do we do? How do we change that? What do we have to do? Now the person's really, they've had their soil tilled. They're really ready to go and hear what it is that you're going to do to show them how they can escape this. You've proven your authenticity with yourself and with your guest. And now they want to know, what's the plan to get through this? And what's the promise? If we can do all this, what's the promise? What's going to happen? And then at the very end, you can just say, okay, Lisa, so what is your company doing to solve that? Or what are you personally doing to solve that? And maybe they have a product or a service or a book or whatever it might be. So then at the very end, after you've gotten through these different pieces, use cases, you're going to have these slides, so you can always pause on the screen when you come back on the replay as well, and watch this or read through this to see how you can go through different subjects. And then, as I said earlier, we really need to think about how we promote. And once you get that MP3 file created, how are you going to then get it out there? And for each podcast, you need 10 to 30 pieces of social media content. Now, there are tools like Canva make it a lot easier to be able to create that. There are tools for smartphones that you can download and create snips. Facebook now has a tool that you can load your podcast up there and allow people to create snippets from your podcast. But that social media piece is going to be really important. Now, this is evergreen content. It can be out there forever. And then you can use the hashtags, the targeting, and the tagging to be able to, again, go back to that question about how to actually engage your audience and how to show your authenticity and your expertise and your understanding, your empathy, and how you're going to help people get through that. Distribution channels. We talked about the podcast platforms, all the different ones. It's very simple once you have a host to be able to then go through and add that to iTunes, Google, Spotify, TuneIn, Radio Public, a variety of others. You can obviously have your social media platforms, which you can do personally or through your business. Paid media is really important. We have great success on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter for that. Twitter more for the professional audiences, Facebook and Instagram for personal. Email marketing, you should have some sort of email blog. This is not to replace anything else that you might do. This is a part of your connection. And I think also to go back to that earlier question of how can you use this to engage your coaches or engage your clients. One thing I like to say to folks when they're using this as a promotional tool is, what are the questions that you get asked the most that you spend a lot of time explaining? Or in a situation like this, where you have a certain amount of time to speak, but there's a lot more that you can go into. You could say to your client, look, you just asked me about nutrition. There's a lot that I could say about nutrition, but I did a whole podcast with this doctor, nutritionist, nurse, person with a condition, chef, whatever that person might be. And you can say, I did that. And we talked for 30 minutes where we spoke through some of the applications. So I'll tell you in 5 minutes what to do. But the big thing is you can keep listening. And that 30 minutes is asynchronous. It's available 24/7, 365. It helps you move on off of that phone call, give the person another resource that not only can they listen to later, but they can listen to it with their partner, their adult children, their caregiver, their parents, whatever it is. So you're actually giving them a tool and they're connecting with you, because the big thing I love about podcasting is the relationship that people create with the hosts. So just like, again, dating myself a little bit, my grandparents used to love listening to Paul Harvey, good day. You can have that sort of relationship where people enjoy tuning in to hear the perspectives, the experience that you're bringing. Printed materials, partner organizations. You can partner with events. That's another great opportunity of creating a podcast, getting free access to events because people want you to talk about it with your audience. They want you to talk about it after it's happened. They want you to talk about it before it's happened, and they want you there. And you can also use that experience, that event, to actually create content while you're there with some of the leaders and people that you want to talk about or talk with. And then community sharing, word of mouth, health podcast network, those sorts of things are other opportunities. Marina, I'm not sure where we are on time, but I see a lot of questions popping up, and I think I'm kind of getting through some of these slides here.
We have about half an hour left.
Oh, haven't got that long. Awesome. Great. So keep the questions coming. I'm glad that I've been speaking really quickly, not looking at a clock, so I don't know how much time we have. So let me go through some of the questions here. Do you want to throw them out to me, Marina, or you want me to find them and read it out?
Sure. Yep. No problem. There's a couple more. So one is, what is the best strategy to invite guests? And then my favorite one, podcast versus Clubhouse. Can you share the pros and cons?
Okay. So let's take that second one first, podcast versus Clubhouse. So I started off as a skeptic of Clubhouse. Then I began to do some Clubhouse earlier in the year, and I began to see some of the applications for it. And then they opened up the algorithm to allow anybody to join it, and I sort of fallen away from it since. I've only just recently begun to re-engage with Clubhouse. There are definitely some great leaders, people I respect and know, and people that I'm meeting and hearing through Clubhouse. I think it's a great platform. I don't think it's the same as a podcast. The thing about a podcast is that it's really important to, in my opinion, to curate that content. People are busy. So yes, we might want to tune into Joe Rogan, and I personally don't care for his content or style, but people may want to tune in and listen to an hour and a half or 3 hours of Joe Rogan talking with Elon Musk and Sanjay Gupta or whoever else. But I think a lot of people, their time is precious. And particularly when we're talking about health topics, there's a certain amount that we can get in and really share that information. So that podcast curation, that thought behind how you're going to present that information in a respectful way that respects your audience's time, gives them what they need at an audio quality that won't turn them off. I mean, one of the stories that I had when I was listening to podcasts and debating whether I should start one was there was a podcast that actually is still available on iTunes from years ago that I listened to these three gentlemen talk on a podcast. They had one microphone, two of them were in the room, and the third person was on his speakerphone. So it was a horrible listening experience. And I was so shocked. This was around healthcare. And I was so shocked that they would be so careless about how they actually listened to it, and just made me feel like I wasn't a priority at all in terms of them having this little conversation with this horrible audio quality. I left that podcast, and that was part of my motivation to try to do something better. So podcast versus Clubhouse, and where Clubhouse can come in really well is twofold. I'm speaking with someone about this. I just spoke with someone the other day about this, and we'll follow up with them shortly. Being able to use Clubhouse to say, hey, what do you guys want to hear? What do you want to talk about? What sorts of things would be valuable to you? Engage if you have an audience there, or if you're listening into rooms, if you're diving into rooms and hearing what people are struggling with and what their questions are. Maybe there's a lot of people in the room and they can't get on stage to ask their questions. That's a good opportunity for you to shape and plan your content. And then once you have content, once you have a podcast out there, the way we were using it earlier in the year was, let's do a podcast, or excuse me, a Clubhouse, and talk about it and invite the guest back on and say to the listeners, hey, look, you've listened to this. You've spent 20, 30 minutes with the guest and with the host. Now let's come on and you can ask your questions. So that's another opportunity to try to use the Clubhouse platform. The things have been moving here. Okay, here we go. So how do we invite guests? I mean, honestly, inviting guests is like the simplest part of being a podcaster, because almost everybody is willing to give it a go, particularly now during the pandemic, where people are so accustomed to using video chat and everything else remotely. Inviting a guest is really not a problem. I would simply reach out to them. I think you can be very strategic about this. One mistake that I made when I started off in 2016 was I didn't aim high enough. I went to people who I knew, and I thought, okay, I'll do this with this guy over here, but I'm not gonna, I'm gonna try to get some experience before I go for some of these really big names, some of these really, healthcare celebrities, if you will. And I think that was a mistake. I mean, the people I spoke to were great and they had great content, but I don't think I served them the best, because since I started with them, I had zero listenership, and I started with them to try to create listenership. And there were more people that should have heard what they had to say. If, on the other hand, I had started and aimed for the sky, and just said, or the stars, and just said, okay, I'm going to try to get the biggest names out there that I can, and I'm going to load the first 10 episodes with the biggest names out there. People will know that this is a podcast to be reckoned with. People will want to come on here, and they'll get value out of this content. And then if I had interviewed the people that I'd done in the first 10 as the second 10, they would have had a better opportunity to get their audience out, because those people who are sort of the celebrities in whatever world you operate in, they have their own following. So when you put out a tweet saying that you've got them on your show, they're going to be able to retweet it and reach their audiences as well. So that's one mistake that I made, is something I'd encourage you to think about, is go for those big names first. What's the worst that's going to happen? They're going to say no, or they'll say maybe later. Go for those names, get some rejections. And if you're not getting any rejections, you're probably not aiming high enough in terms of the caliber of people that you want to share with your audience, because you're going to want to have some no's along the way. I mean, I don't expect Dr. Fauci to take my call and get on this, and I'm just fine with that. What else?
So
what else we got?
So I have a question that came actually from a couple of different people, and this is the other side of this, and it's about the best strategy to reach out to podcasters to be considered to be a guest.
Right.
How do you ask somebody? Yeah, that's a great question.
So, yeah, that's great. And I won't try to find this slide. Well, maybe I should try to find the slide now, but it's really about service. How do you, let me go back, here you go. You're not pitching them. You don't want to pitch your product. I have so many people. It's one of my pet peeves. Every day, almost every hour, I get a pitch from someone saying, oh, let me introduce you to Sarah so-and-so, and Sarah wants to talk about this. And what they want to do is they want to come on and talk about themselves. It goes to that other side where it's like, okay, here's the problem we're trying to solve. Here's more about me. Here's more about me. Here's more about me. Here's more about me. Aren't I great? Isn't this all wonderful? People don't care. What do they care about? They care about their problems. They want solutions. They want to know that there are people out there who understand them, which goes to that slide I showed earlier about talk about the problem, talk about the pain, talk about the pain. What's the plan? How are we going to get through this? What's the promise of getting through that? So, so going to these hosts then and pitching yourselves, do not say, in my opinion, that, hey, I want to come on and I want to talk about my program, my this, my book, my whatever, my expertise, my whatever. No, I've listened to your show. I understand you're trying to serve people in this way. I resonate with that because I used to be one of those people. And now I've been able to develop these different ways to serve them. And I think it would benefit your audience for us to go through the 3 top ways that we see individuals, businesses, governments, whatever, addressing their problems. Or the top 2 things that I see people are doing that sets them back as we go into the holiday season or start a new year or get into the winter months. Talk about it and think about how you can frame it in a social media post or as the title of the episode that will make people click. Because remember, when you're creating a podcast, the first thing people have to do is they have to see it. And they have to agree. There's a contract taking place. They have to agree to listen to your content. And by tapping, they're signing off and say, I agree. So you need to create something that says, this isn't Sarah Smith talking about something rather. You want to make sure that it's saying, hey, these are the top 3 things that people with type 1 diabetes are battling as we come into the Thanksgiving holiday. Okay, well, we know what that person's talking about, and let's now go engage with that. And when they press that button, they're making that commitment. So think about that as you're trying to think about the shows that you want to pitch. Listen to them, honestly listen to them. Don't just listen to the most recent one. Go back and listen to one of the early ones, listen to some in the middle, understand what it is that they're trying to do, their style, compliment them on something. And again, not on the most recent one, because everybody, I mean, I get all these pitches and all they've done is they've gone and listened to the most recent one and said, oh, great job here. Let me give you another person that can go on there. Now, does that answer that question? Have I beat that horse to death enough?
We shall see. We shall see if we have any more questions regarding the topic. I have a couple more. Do you want me to
Yeah,
ask,
please. Tell me what you got.
Okay, so these 2 kind of go together. So one is, how can I create content and spread it out over a period of time? And then another one is, how can I create constant content? It seems exhausting to be recording 5 times a week.
Oh, yeah. You don't want to do that. Yeah, you don't want to do that. So great questions. Let's again go through. I've got a slide for that. Let's talk about the planning process. So trying to understand how you can create something. So when I started off, I scheduled an hour for my podcast. Big mistake. If you schedule an hour and you want a 30-minute podcast, you've got half that you got to cut out. So if you want a half an hour podcast, you better schedule it for half an hour. If you want a 20-minute podcast, you might schedule it for 20, 22 minutes because you're going to want to try to keep things short and on target. And that way, again, there's an implicit agreement between you and the guest to say, okay, we're going to keep this short and tight. So I was on a podcast, producing a podcast for someone once, and the very first question, the guest gave an 8.5-minute answer. And there's no way people are going to stick around for 8.5 minutes to answer one question. So you got to be really short and punchy and think about it. However, for a podcast or for a webinar or for a podcast that you might create with someone, think about how you can break it up in chunks. Think about how you can lead that conversation to say, okay, for the first part, we're going to talk about this. We're going to talk about what the problem is, what it means. Let's talk about the anatomy or behavior or whatever it might be. Now, let's talk about genetic risks or lifestyle changes or things like that can happen. And you can sort of create it with a bit of segue built in. And you can actually then transition between different shows. Now, what I don't suggest you do is launch those 4 topics or 5 topics out of that 40-minute conversation and launch them all on the same day. Because just like if you went out and put out a stack of magazines, the one that's going to get picked up as people walk by is the one that's on top. So if you put out all 5 of those or 4 of those at the same time, the only one that's going to see, or the one that's going to see the most downloads is the one that's on top, because that's what the programs, the podcast apps are set up to do, is to pick the most recent one. And you're just not going to have people, as they get in their cars and press play, they're not going to necessarily know that there's 4 that are sitting behind that magazine front. So put that out every 2 days. I'd leave it at least 48 hours between posts, because it's in that first 48-hour cycle that you got to wait for all of the podcast players to pick it up off your media feed. You got to make sure that people have had a chance to go do their routine where they listen, whether it's something as simple as ironing or cooking, or whether it's exercising or commuting, or just getting ready in the morning. You got to make sure they've had that chance to have that routine and schedule that out over time. Does that answer your question, Marina? Was there something else to that?
No, that was like I said, if we didn't answer, I'm sure we're going to hear back.
Okay.
Shall I ask you another one?
Sure.
We have about 20 minutes left, just letting you know.
Oh, brilliant. I'm feeling good now. We've got lots of time.
Okay, so this is a really good question, because from one side, and you and I have talked about this, right? Is it, do you create podcasts to be profitable, or do you create podcasts to get your name out there? So this question is more about wanting the podcast to become profitable, and is that possible? And about paid subscriptions. If you recommend that, if that's a thing, what do you think about that?
That is a thing. It is not at the point that I recommend it yet. We're experimenting with it. I haven't found a good solution for that yet. I mean, there's good solutions in terms of technology. Apple now offers that. Spotify offers it. There's some other solutions out there whose names are escaping me right now, but there are opportunities to do podcast subscriptions. But really, it's a challenge. Again, using Joe Rogan as an example, don't particularly care for his content, but he's a leader in the podcast space, so we can't ignore that. His listenership reportedly has dropped after moving to Spotify. He's behind a paywall. His YouTube views are open as they take different snippets of his content and make that available on YouTube. But I don't think that putting things behind a paywall for a lot of the listeners on this, of these sorts of content, is really going to be the best move to scale. There may be some things you may want to put behind a paywall, partly because of the value of it, but also partly because of the sensitivity to it. With some of the podcasts we're working on, we don't necessarily want everybody to be able to access things. For example, type 1 diabetes affects a lot of children. We're doing a podcast episode around sex and the impact on blood glucose levels. We don't necessarily want my daughter listening to that. So I'll put that behind a paywall, so she has to ask for permission to listen to it. So there can be some sensitivities around that aspect. How do you monetize? I mean, honestly, this is the whole reason I'm able to do what I'm doing. I started off doing a podcast really just to, number one, with the attitude of service. My career has been built around, how can I bring value to this experience? How can I do something to help lift up the people that I'm working to serve? And podcasts were a way to do that. And fortunately, through being able to serve people effectively and create content that people found useful and resonated with them, I was able to have inquiries from people to say, could they advertise on it? Because when you create value of an audience, people want that. You got to think about what they want. The advertisers want attention. That's what you're competing for. You are competing for people's attention. There are thousands of ways that they can spend every minute of the day. You are trying to convince a potential listener to spend their time with you. And if you're able to do that successfully, and I don't care if it's 200 people or 200,000 people, if you're able to do that, there's going to be someone out there who values that attention that you're giving them. And I work with podcasters that do have audiences of 250, 300 people, but the focus of their content, it's not about the numbers. It's about the focus of who they're connecting with and the value of that attention. And then this isn't, if you were to Google this, if you guys have done some of the search on that, if you look at it, it's often done on a cost per thousand. So if you were to advertise through Anchor's paid program, or some of the other ones, I think of their names. AdvertiseCast is another network that you can run advertising through. They're going to pay you $25 or $30 per 1,000 downloads. CPM, cost per mille, which is Latin for 1,000. So cost per 1,000, and you get $25 or $30 for that, and you've got 250 listeners. you're not going to be able to eat if that's a business model. However, because of what you're doing and what you're talking to, you may find corporate sponsors that are willing to do that, willing to engage with them, because the value of their product, they know if they get a conversion of 5% of your audience of 200 people, that it's worth X amount for them, or even 2% of your audience of 200 people, then they know that there's a value to that subscription, that product, that service, that visit, that assessment, that test, whatever it is, that's going to be worth it for them. So, frankly, again, not to promote what I'm doing, but that's one of the things we're doing with Health Podcast Network, is to create an opportunity, because individually, a lot of podcasters don't have the ability to connect with advertisers because they're busy doing other things, and they don't necessarily want to, or need to, or know how to, or want to know how to create an insertion order process with a vendor, or even go through the vendor approval process for some of these larger companies. And we're able to do that through Health Podcast Network, to be able to sort of broker that, but then also add additional value through social media advertising and so forth. Advertising and podcasts, is that the question that I have now, Marina?
If that's the one you want to take, yeah.
Yep. So there's two that just popped up here. 13 minutes left. Great. Transcriptions and advertising. So I was sort of talking about advertising and sponsors. Let me just touch on that a little bit more. I have some slides. I won't try to find them in this deck. Advertising has come a long way. And there's a couple different ways that you can do that. When I started doing it, I would take the MP3 file that I recorded with a guest. I would record an ad. Coming up on June 14th is this event. Make sure you apply to attend, whatever it might be. And I would save those two things together. I would save it as one big file. And I'd load it up, and then people who requested that file through their podcast player, they would hear, hey, coming up on June 15th, there's this thing happening. But what happened on June 16th or 17th, after that date has passed? Well, if they download that MP3 file, it's still there. Or I have to go in and replace it with something else, very manual. Can be done. It's possible. You may have something that's evergreen that isn't date associated. It might be about a subscription or a service or something like that you can always advertise. But there are other services that are out there. I know Libsyn has a plan, Acast has a plan. I think even Buzzsprout and Podbean have plans that you can. I know Omni has a plan where you can actually insert ads and then remove them. And the neat thing about this is that if you have an audience that's around Memphis or Boston or around a specific area, you can actually tell the host, the media host, again, Buzzsprout, Podbean, Libsyn, whomever it might be, you can say in the loading up of the ad, I want this ad to air within this 60-mile radius of Memphis, Tennessee. So that way, if there's a home rehabilitation provider or a food delivery service or medical equipment installation business that operates in that geographic area, it's very highly targeted to those listeners. So that is another way to think about it. And again, that's one of the things that we try to do through Health Podcast Network, and we're doing with Health Unmuted as well, to be able to advertise things that are highly relevant. It's serving the listener's interest. And that's something I always come back to. When someone has entered a contract with you, a listener has entered into an implicit contract with you because they've read the headline, or they trust you enough that it doesn't matter what the headline says, they're going to click on it because they're a loyal listener. When they press play, and you can then, they've opted in. They've now opted into that contract to hear what you have to share with them. And if you can then give them an additional value that's fully aligned or closely aligned with their interest, that's saving them time, that's saving them frustration, that's introducing them to something. And that's also something that advertisers are prepared to pay for. Because for you to hear about ABC Company or Acme Co., that's one thing. But when you talk about it, that's your relationship, that's your trust, that's your credibility, that you're saying ABC Acme Company is a great provider of this. Your listeners are going to trust you to tell them the right thing. And that's part of the reason why the $25 or $30 CPM is just a ridiculous amount. We need to make sure that we're leveraging the value of the audience, the value of the relationship. And there's no question the advertisers are doing the calculation on the ROI for that. Transcripts, I go back and forth on transcripts. love them, leave them. I don't know. It really depends on how much effort you want to put into it. We've done them. We haven't seen a massive increase in SEO. We haven't seen an increase in visits to those pages that host the transcripts. We haven't taken the time to try to take those transcripts and have them translated. That's another option. If you wanted to do that in another language, I don't speak Spanish. I do all my podcasts in English. We could take a transcript and have that done into Spanish, which would help resource another audience. That's one application that could be useful. Again, you can find people on Upwork and Fiverr that will do that with them. And there are also automatic systems. I don't really like the automatic systems. I find them very frustrating. You can use Descript, you can use Otter. They're automatic. And so I do like that aspect of it, but I don't, and you can then go through and manually change it. But these systems that say, hey, just put this little frame into your website and we'll transcribe it, you don't have to touch it. I've looked at a lot of those. They really don't do a good job. You really need to go into Otter or Descript or one of these other platforms and make the manual changes to make sure that things are clearly laid out, because the way we talk isn't necessarily the way that things are clearly conveyed. You might need some additional periods in there, some commas, some capitalization, some page breaks, some paragraph breaks to be able to make sure that it's clear to the reader what actually was being said in an audio format.
We only have about 8 minutes left, but there's some really great questions coming in.
All right, what do we got? Which ones do you want to take on?
So there's a really great one about somebody who already has a podcast, but they can't retain the audience and the listeners. Do you have any tips on how to scale?
So I'd be curious what they're looking at that says they can't retain them. Maybe that's some of the algorithms or some of the analytics that some of the platforms provide. They'll tell you how many times people come back. So again, finding a potential listener, I look at this sort of like a restaurant business. That's sort of the way I look at the Health Podcast Network is like a restaurant association. And if you own a restaurant and you say that you serve Mexican food and people come in and they have a great experience and they enjoy the food and they get what they came in there for, they're going to talk about that to other people and they're going to come back when they're in the mood for Mexican food again. And if conversely, if you serve them a bunch of pasta dishes and don't give them a good experience, or the service is bad or it's slow or whatever, they're not going to come back. So that's a big challenge here, is to make sure, and this goes back to that quality piece. And when I was talking about that example of those 3 gentlemen that I heard on this terrible one microphone and a speakerphone, they didn't give me a good experience. They served me Chinese food when I came in looking for Mexican food, and that's not going to keep me coming back. And I actually left the restaurant in the middle of that experience. So if that's the case, if you're finding that people are tuning in once but not coming back for subsequent episodes, I'd really be clear on what it is that you're doing. One thing could be that you're doing great with your content creating, but I know I dealt with one podcaster who said they were trying to go really broad, and really, you might say, okay, I want to handle this particular big topic, women's health issue, or a bias issue, or racial issue, or an access or insurance issue. We're going to take this on. And then I want to go over here and I want to talk about this other thing. It can be far too varied, and you might attract somebody to come and talk to listen in on one conversation, but they may not be the same listener that wants to go over and listen to the next one about something completely different. So in my mind, niching is really important. Really being clear. It goes back to the early thing I said at the very beginning of this. Think about carefully who it is that you're trying to reach. How do you serve them? How did you get through your training and through your professional practice to try to cultivate who it is that you're trying to reach, and be very clear on that, and think about how you can serve them. Because if you're going to be serving different people, different meals, they might not come back all the time because they might not want that variety. What else do we have here?
Okay, so there is one about co-hosting. This person wants to have a co-host, but not in all the episodes. Do you think that would be odd for the audience?
I don't think it'll be odd. I think as long as you're clear with the explanations around it. I personally don't do a lot of podcasts that have more than 2 speakers. I find them more difficult to edit. I find that tend to be longer when you have three people trying to get points across or two people ask questions. It just adds time to it. So I think it's important to be clear about what it is you're trying to do. Maybe you're trying to do one of these, sort of more conversational, spend time, and have breakfast with me sort of conversation and hear our stories. I just don't have a lot of patience for these podcasts that they're going through and they're talking about all these sorts of things that are happening in their lives, unless I have a real need to know them. There are a couple of gentlemen who have a highly unproduced podcast that I listen to very regularly, and they do go into some of those things, but I know those gentlemen and I'm interested in their lives, and it's a way for me to literally like have a meal with them. Sometimes I've had a meal while I'm watching or listening to them talk. But if you're trying to reach people you don't know and you're talking about these small things, for me personally, it loses my interest. I want to get in and it's that contract of what's the value that we're trying to exchange, and how can I learn and be better from this exchange. I know we're almost out of time. Big thing that I would say is people are buying transformation. When they're entering that contract with you and they're pressing play, they're agreeing to spend time with you because at the end of that podcast, they will be transformed in some way. I don't care what you do, what business you're in, what training you have, whether you work in a fast food joint or whether you are a researcher at one of the leading pharmaceutical companies, you are dealing in transformation. People are making a contract with you to get from their current state to their future state. They're more enlightened, they're more empathetic, they're more aware, they're able to have some tools. They're doing something that will transform them. And that's something you need to think about as you're creating your content and creating your headlines and creating your social media. What are we doing to serve the listener and help take them from where they currently are to a place where they want to be at the end of that episode?
That was amazing. Thank you. So I have one more for you, and this is from me. I also think a good lesson learned on this masterclass is you got to roll with the punches, because I was not expecting to be kind of co-hosting this with you. So, but I guess you gotta go with the flow. So my question to you is, now that I'm on this, is the theme of this year's event is building blocks to happy and healthy humans. So what do you think makes a happy and healthy human?
Ooh, wow. I'll only speak from my own experience. Purpose, service, those things make a healthy, happy human. What is that quote that, of course, now on camera and on recording, I won't be able to remember it, or something along the lines of, the how dare you ask what the meaning of life is? What meaning will you give to your life? And that's really the way I view things is, I'm not looking to the universe to tell me why I'm here. I'm here to make a contribution, to serve, to help people get where they want to go. I think that's probably the reason why a lot of the people who are tuned in here and why you're doing what you're doing, Marina, is because, people want to help other people get and be the best version of themselves. And I think when people can see that, and when we realize that we don't all live here alone, we're all part of a community. We've got this wonderful nature preserve of Earth that we need to protect, and we need to support one another. There was something else I heard the other day, which was, we all have two lives, and the second life starts when you realize you only have one life. So when we can take a look at this and say, how do we do the most, contribute the most, and try to make the world a better place, that gives me, and that makes me a healthy, happy human.
Oh, I love that. Thank you. And that second quote, that's actually what I start my speeches with, because I feel like my second life, that's when I realized that there's only one.
Absolutely.
Thank you so much. This is a great point to stop at. And this has been absolutely helpful. I know I definitely learned so much from this masterclass. And thank you on behalf of our coaching community. Thank you, Dan.
Feel free to contact me, Dan at missionbasedmedia.com. Let me know when you've got a podcast that you'd like me to listen to or give you some advice. I'm really passionate about what you guys are doing and about how I can help support that through the knowledge I've gained through podcasting. I'm delighted to help however I can. Thanks for the invitation. It's good to be here.
Thank you. Take care. Good night, everyone.